10, 9, 8, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines running, commit, liftoff. We have liftoff.
Hello and welcome to the premiere episode of the Launchpad Space Podcast. My name's Paul Ring and I'll be your host as we explore the history of spaceflight in fact and fiction. In future episodes, we'll be geeking out over everything from Sputnik and Apollo to Star Trek, Star Wars, and The Expanse. It'll be a smorgasbord of movie and book reviews as well as deep dives into the history of real-life space exploration. I'm working to bring you some of the smartest and most influential people in their fields right here to you. Sounds great, right? Good. Well, for this first episode, I'm diving into my archives to bring you an interview I did with Apollo astronaut Alan Bean in 2009. Sadly, he died 2 years ago, but I had the pleasure to talk to him for a pair of newspaper articles I wrote to mark the 40th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon landing. I'll post a link to the stories in the show notes, which can be found wherever you discovered this podcast, as well as our website, launchpadshow.com. I did a bunch of interviews for these articles, which were about Boston area businesses and organizations that played key roles in helping man set foot on the moon. Years before, when I was covering aerospace for the MetroWest Daily News in Framingham, Massachusetts, I was entrusted with an Excel spreadsheet with the names, telephone numbers, email addresses, and sometimes even physical addresses of current and former astronauts. In the wrong hands, this could be very dangerous. But I was asked by NASA to use discretion, and not wanting to burn bridges, I stayed away from the listings marked "Do Not Call." A couple of notes even said "Do Not Contact." It was daunting to look at them. After all, these were my childhood heroes. Anyway, I picked out a few names and sent out emails and waited. After a few weeks, I had pretty much given up hope of hearing from the astronauts. You know what happens next, right? One Sunday night when I was working to put out the Monday's paper, my cell phone rang. I looked at it, and it was a call from Texas. For a second, I thought someone from NASA PR was calling to chew me out for using the list. When I picked up the phone and heard a man with a handsome Texas drawl ask, "Is Paul Ring there?" When he announced himself as Alan Bean, the Alan Bean, the guy who walked on the moon, the artist, I practically fell out of my chair. What followed was a half-hour interview where we covered a variety of subjects that were part of my article. I didn't use a whole lot of it, but what was left is still gold for a space nut like me. And that's why I'm sharing it with you on this podcast. The interview took place on July 12, 2009, only a few days before I had to write the articles. Thankfully, Al Bean was a very gracious interview subject, and his quotes really pulled the articles together. First thing I asked him about was the very beginning of his first mission, Apollo 12. During that launch on November 14th, 1969, the Saturn V launch vehicle he was riding in with Commander Pete Conrad and Command Module pilot Richard Gordon was struck by lightning. Twice.
We launched up into a thunderstorm, which, I don't know, we didn't think at the time that was such a big deal, and apparently NASA and the launch crew didn't think so. But what occurred was that the rocket exhaust is ionized, so what we did, we were a big lightning rod, and as we went into this cloud, we were grounded back on the launch pad, and the lightning in the cloud hit us and went down to the ground, and in hitting us, it tripped off the most of the fuel cells, all of the fuel cells really, which was our primary electrical supply. So all of our main buses, both of them, and the AC buses, both of them, went down, and a lot of associated equipment. It was real scary. We'd never practiced it. We had no thought in design of the spacecraft that this would ever occur. Even though we were out of electrical power, more or less, not out of it, but low on it, we were able to get into orbit, and then on the way up into orbit, we were able to reset the fuel cells, get electrical power back, and get pretty much to normal. So thank goodness for the designers of the all of the hardware that was involved in that particular potential catastrophe. It didn't happen because the hardware designers had done such a good job.
That was the biggest in-flight emergency NASA would face until Apollo 13 5 months later. Everyone knows about Apollo 13 thanks to the Tom Hanks movie. We'll be talking about that in a future episode too. The next subject I asked Al Bean about was the Apollo guidance computer. Designed by the MIT Instrumentation Lab under Charles Stark Draper, it was incredibly humble by today's standards. Think a Commodore 64 or Apple II from the early 80s. But it was very reliable and powerful enough to get astronauts safely to the moon and back a total of 9 times.
Well, these computers we thought of them as small. They were like a small to medium-sized suitcase. They were down in the equipment bay. All we had in front of us that we thought of mostly as the computer was the display. And it's mentioned to me frequently nowadays about, the computer doesn't have as much memory, erasable memory, or whatever is capability as a watch does nowadays, or certainly it didn't as a cell phone. But we never thought of it that way. We thought of it as the best that was available at the time. And so we were glad to have these computers. They were very reliable. They had to be programmed frequently because, not reprogrammed, but programmed because their capacity wasn't all that much. For example, when we got ready to launch, the ground would load the computer with the proper programs to monitor the launch and launch aborts if we had to make them. Then once we got into orbit, we opened up the computer to mission control, and they would load new programs that had to do with burning towards the moon, translunar insertion, as we called it. And then when that was finished, it loaded for a coast. And then when we got near the moon, it loaded different things. So it was continually having to be reprogrammed from the ground to do its job because it just didn't have that much capacity. Another interesting thing about it then is you didn't have alphanumerics, so there was no words there. What you had was a number saying this is program number 10 or whatever it was, and then you had 3 registers with numbers in them. And you didn't know unless you memorized it or read it from a book whether like the top register that had a bunch of numbers on it was range rate, altitude, what? And you didn't know where the decimal point was either unless you memorized it. Now, we quickly memorized those things in training and in the simulator. So we didn't think anything of it that it didn't have, a little note beside that said range rate, feet per second, or whatever it was. We were dealing with the best there was available at the time. So the computers were wonderful. The one in the Lunar module was the same thing, programmed differently, of course. And they worked perfectly on all missions. I don't recall a incident that, we felt that the computer did something wrong. We every once in a while would put in a wrong number or read it wrong or do something like that, standard human error, but we always caught it, and it didn't have any effect on any of the missions. It was a wonderful computer, and it did its job as good as any computer could do at the time. Now, one other feature of this computer that I remembered, I remember it this way. It's hard to know 40 years ago all the details, but this was one of the first computers that real time could guide something. Now, we have computers in airplanes that fly them now real time, but before this period, computers just kind of generated numbers, and then you looked at the numbers, and that's what you did with them. It didn't do anything, but our computer would guide the spacecraft to an attitude. It would hold it there. It would start the burn on time. It would cut it off within 100th of a second. It would measure all this stuff. It was a great computer. It was fabulous. Now, when they go back to the moon, they'll have a lot better computer, and it'll be smaller and do all sorts of stuff. But I don't think that's the critical thing about going back to the moon. The critical thing is fuel, rocket engines, things like that. And that's where the money is. So, expense of going back. So even though it'll have a better computer, I don't think it's going to be any easier going home because the computer was never a problem, really. The problem was always the rocket engines and, things like that. The boosters, the service module engines. They're still, they haven't advanced as far from the 60s as computers have.
One thing that improved quite a bit over the years was the food. As astronauts started staying in space for longer periods, they wanted more than bread cubes and pureed meals in tubes. Food for the Apollo program took a giant leap in quality thanks to work done at the former Natick Army Labs in Natick, Massachusetts.
The food was pretty good. It reminded me of, at the time, the food you took out camping, because most of it was rehydratable. We had a couple of items that, like roast beef and gravy, that you could open up and it was cold, but it was at least not rehydratable. Now, I can't remember how many items we had, but you had to select the meals you wanted from those items. And we tasted all of them. Everyone tasted all the food, ate some of it. So pretty soon in the training we said, I think I like this, I don't like that. The Tang or whatever it was, called grapefruit drink or something, well, that was pretty good. Peaches were great. Strawberries were great. But some other stuff wasn't all that wonderful. And so, you didn't eat much of that. I remember that mealtime with that food, by the way, the reason the food was not as tasty as something else, some on Earth, is because they had to make it and pack it and put it in the spacecraft so long beforehand that in order to keep the bacteria count to an acceptable level, they had to pasteurize almost everything. And if you pasteurize stuff, it sometimes will modify the flavor. And so that's what was going on. That's why we couldn't just take a few cookies or something like that. Everyone was concerned about bacteria and saying, well, what if they get sick up there and we've sent them all the way to the moon and then they're vomiting in their spacesuit and it jams it up and they could die or something. So there was a lot of concern, rightfully so, about all this. I think it's somewhat alleviated now with the space shuttle because if they go out and were to get sick in repairing the Hubble Space Telescope, they've got more people. They could come back inside and go out 2 days later and do it. So that wasn't the case going to the moon. So that's why the food was different.
Of course, my next question was obvious. What was Al Bean's favorite meal? Well, it was a down-to-earth choice for a down-to-earth guy. I'll let him tell you about it.
My favorite food on Earth is spaghetti, okay? I eat it every day. I still do. I eat once a day, I eat spaghetti. So I'm thinking to myself, I want to be the first human to eat spaghetti on the moon. And spaghetti and meat sauce was one of the items that was there, but it didn't taste or look like spaghetti and meat sauce. Anyway, I thought, I hope Neil or Buzz don't eat that because I want to be the first guy to do it. So I kept an eye on their menu as they were getting ready for flight, and I was aware that, became aware that isn't what was on their menu, and I was thinking, that's just great. So whenever I went to the moon, I had them pack 2 first meals. One was spaghetti, and then peaches that were great, and then grapefruit drink. Eat that, and then the other one that I had them pack and put on the lunar module, I'm going to bring it home in the command module and put it on my wall. And I'm standing here in the studio right now looking at it. It looks a little darker than it did when I brought it home, but there it is inside this framed shadow box, and there's the 2 spoons we had, the spoon I had in the command module and the spoon I had in the lunar module. So I have great memories of the food we had in Apollo, although it reminded me of sort of the kinds you get maybe when you're in the hospital or out camping. It just is fairly mild, and I told you already why it had to be that way.
I asked him if he remembered coming up to the Boston area to visit any of the places that were working on parts of the Apollo program. Here's what he had to say.
Oh, yeah, I came up to this area a lot, particularly to MIT, because they had, the software program. And so we came up there early on, and they presented to us how they thought the software should work for us to do our job. And they were, Mr. Draper, I think it was, it's a long time ago. He and his team, had invented this software, and they said, this is how we think it should work. Okay, then NASA, engineers, flight, mission controllers and things, they had their own ideas, and none of them were fully formed because nobody knew how to do this thing. And so we then took theirs, and then that's MIT's, and we tried to, make it work in the simulators and things. And then in the doing, people from mission control might say, look, we've got to change this little thing or that thing, or put the third one in front of the first one, or whatever it was. There was a continual number of changes as we used it, or used it as we thought we should use it. So then we'd go back up there, and then they'd go through it again, change like we thought, and show us how they thought it might work. And so this was an iterative project till well into the Apollo program. And I'm sure that after each flight, then some people at NASA, not us particularly, would get together with MIT and the software and say, the next mission is different. We got to do this. We got to do that. Let's make some changes. Let's refine what we just did over here, or this thing didn't work like we thought. So it was a never-ending effort by scientists, software engineers, astronauts, flight controllers. Yes, the fact that there were so many people that had to use these things and make them work correctly in critical situations meant that the effort to coordinate that MIT did was really astounding, really amazing. And there would be a lot of last-minute things. I can remember back on Apollo 9, we backed them up. They came, the Apollo 9 crew, Jim McDivitt, Dave Scott, and Rusty Schweikert, they observed that their last rendezvous maneuver was unusually big, and they wondered about it, and then they talked to the simulator people about it, and talked to the flight controllers and a lot of other people, and finally they had to go back to MIT and say, look, something is wrong with these equations in there, because instead of the corrections getting less as you get closer, as you would expect, mathematically, right at the very end, suddenly they get bigger. And I can remember there was a big hurrah when everybody said, no, this is the way it is, et cetera, et cetera. It's just, it's just your simulator is wrong or something. Well, they coordinated, worked on it. This wasn't an easy thing to solve. And finally, they said, you're right. The equations we've got in here aren't exactly like the way the thing is flying. And they changed those. This was maybe a month or two before flight. And then everything worked okay. So you see, it's a very much team-oriented effort to try to figure out how to do these things. It's not like a pilot goes to American Airlines and he's given a big book and it tells him how to do it. And then if he does that, he flies great and everything works. Every once in a while, someone finds a little error and changes 2 or 3 lines on a procedure or something. You get, and NASA, they're in a book yet because nobody knows how to do it. And so you have to work with all the interested parties to find out how to do it. It makes it interesting, but you've got to have a good attitude about, giving and taking because everybody sort of thinks they know how, but they don't realize that there's other players in the game that have to be satisfied also. Everyone has to feel by the time you fly that what they can do what they need to do to make the mission work. And that's hard to do, by the way. It's hard to do. My hat's off to the people at MIT at the Draper Lab. That was a tough job. They did it well, and and we all worked with them as best we could. We were trying to figure out how to get to the moon and back and live through it. So when someone says, hey, you need to go over here and do something, you say, okay, let's go do it. But you're still thinking as you go over there, how are we going to get this rendezvous to work? And then you get there, you give a speech, do whatever you can, try to do the best you can. But when you walk out the door, then you're saying, we got to come up with a way to make this rendezvous work. We needed to coordinate as much as we could, and so did and I'm sure when we left the meeting, we're saying, we got to figure out how to make the rendezvous work. And when they left the meeting, they're saying, look, that software anomaly that we've been working on for 3 weeks, we got to fix that thing. So, everybody was doing this. Everybody was working together, but everybody had to find a way to make their part work. It was tough, but it was great. Not everybody gets a chance to work on an impossible dream in their professional lifetime, and we did, and that is a blessing, in my opinion, in anybody's life. When I meet them and when I'm out speaking or something, they'll say, working there, working on Apollo was the high point of my professional career. I'm so glad that I had a chance to be part of Apollo. And me too, by the way.
Alan Bean went on to command the second manned Skylab mission in 1973. He and his crewmates Owen Garriott and Jack Lausma lived and worked aboard the space station for a then-record 59 days. During the mission, he performed an EVA with Garriott to install a new set of gyroscopes to replace failed units, a common task performed aboard the current International Space Station. He also tested a prototype astronaut maneuvering unit inside the cavernous laboratory, which had been built inside an unused Saturn V third stage. 2 years later, Bean served as the backup U.S. commander for the Apollo-Soyuz test project, when an Apollo command module linked up with the Soviet Soyuz capsule for the first time. He retired from the Navy in 1975, but continued with NASA as head of the Astronaut Candidate Operations and Training Group. In that role, he was involved in recruiting the first female and minority astronauts in 1978. He even made a recruiting film with actress Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura on the original Star Trek TV series. I'll put a link to that video in the show notes. Bean retired from NASA in 1981 as the U.S. returned to spaceflight with the launch of the Columbia on STS-1. Then, as his NASA biography ironically says, thereafter he became a space painter of some repute. In total, he spent 1,671 hours and 45 minutes in space. 10 hours and 26 minutes of that time was spent performing EVAs on the moon and in Earth orbit. Alan Bean was a Renaissance man. He had the technical skill to be a test pilot and an astronaut, yet he also saw the beauty of the universe and sought to share that as an artist. On November 14, 2009, the 40th anniversary of the launch of his Apollo 12 mission, he held a signing at Seymour, Connecticut. I drove 3 hours in the pouring rain to meet him in person. A rainstorm. Isn't that appropriate? Despite getting wet while standing outside, I was glad I made the effort. When it was finally my turn, I told him who I was, and he remembered me right away. I gave him copies of the articles I wrote, and he said he would read them on the trip home to Houston. I also paid to have him sign a book and a print of one of his paintings. I'll never forget what he wrote in the book. To Paul, fellow artist, with a star. I was floored. I questioned the inscription, and he said, I'll work in oils, you work in words. I had tears in my eyes as I thanked him and walked away. That's the kind of guy Al Bean was. Well, I hope you enjoyed this premiere episode of the Launchpad Space Podcast. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere good podcasts are aggregated. And please leave a review. Let me know what you liked or what you didn't like. There are lots of ways to contact us, too. We're online at Launchpad Space 1 on Twitter, Launchpad Space Podcast on Facebook, and our homepage is www.launchpadshow.com. Do you have any interesting Alan Bean stories you'd like to share? Or maybe an idea for a future episode? If so, email us at launchpadspacepodcast@gmail.com. We'll talk again on the next episode of the Launchpad Space Podcast. Thanks for taking the time to check us out. And the Launchpad is